Hi everybody, welcome to this week's Who's Who Story Time. This week we're going to talk about two activists who participated in school strikes, which means that they did not go to school in order to support a protest or a movement. And the first person we're going to talk about is Audrey Faye Hendricks, who at 8 years old participated in the Children's March or the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And she was 8 years old and she went to jail for a week. And this was on purpose. She wanted to go to jail in order to support the movement because at the time they were hoping to fill the jails in Birmingham, Alabama with so many people that the people who were continuing the civil rights movement with the protests and the marches didn't have to fear going to jail, that they could keep marching because the jails were so full of people. So the book that we're reading about Audrey Faye Hendricks is called The Youngest Marcher, the story of Audrey Faye Hendricks, a young civil rights activist. It was written by Cynthia Levinson and it was illustrated by Vanessa Brantley Newton. And we're gonna look at the back of the book because it wouldn't be a Who's Who story time without looking at the back of the book. So at the back of this book, there are sources, so that's a bibliography. So there are books you can read about the Children's March, about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and the author talks about her interview that she conducted with Audrey Faye Hendricks. And do you remember last week how Tito Puente, Mambo King, had a line of music at the back of that book? Well, this book has a recipe. That's so cool. So this book has a recipe for hot rolls baptized in butter because in this book, that is what Audrey's family eats when Dr. Martin Luther King comes to visit. And again, there's a biography and a timeline to help you better understand the historical moment the book is situated in. So let's get to reading. This is called The Youngest Marcher. All right, I'll get closer. Whenever Mike flew into town, Audrey and her mama cooked. Barbecued ribs, stewed greens, sweet potato souffle, and Audrey's favorite, hot rolls baptized in butter. Other folks knew Mike as Martin or Dr. King. The Hendrickses used his nickname. They did the same with other ministers too, like Fred Shuttlesworth and Jim Bevel. After Mike blessed the feast, Mama expected Audrey to keep still during supper. But when grown-ups talked about wiping out the segregation laws that kept black and white people apart in Birmingham, she just had to speak up. Audrey intended to go places and do things like nobody else. I want to eat ice cream inside Newberry's. I want to sit downstairs at the Alabama. I don't want hand-me-down school books, Audrey said. But stools at the counter, plush movie theater seats, books so fresh they'd crackle when you opened them, those were for white children. Hush, Mama hissed Mama. 9-year-old children should not speak in front of company, especially ministers like Mike, Fred, and Jim, who were bringing dreams of justice. Audrey knew all about segregation. She knew to pay the driver at the front of the bus, then step off and walk around the back door. Drink from the fountain with the dirty bowl and warm water. Use the freight elevator at department stores downtown. Front row seats, cool water, elevators with white-gloved operators. Laws said that those were for white folks. Every Monday night, Audrey and her mama and daddy and her aunts, uncles, and cousins joined neighbors and friends at Fred's church for worship, fellowship, and testimony. She sang and swayed along with the movement choir, her voice spirited and spiritual. Black and white together, we shall overcome. For once, she didn't have to keep still. Then came testimonies. White store owners won't hire me. Ku Kluxers chased me. Police called me names. The hateful stories made Audrey squirm. She tried to tell her mama, "That's not right." "Shh," said Mama. How could Mama expect her to hush? She had to make things right, but what could she do? When Mike visited Fred's church, thousands of people crowded around her to hear him preach. In a voice as taut as steel cables, as smooth as glass, he intoned, "Segregation is morally wrong and sinful. That's true. Fired up, Audrey sat taller. An unjust law is no law at all, he proclaimed. Audrey had listened to Mike explain his plan at her supper table and knew what he meant. If a law is unjust, disobey it. Sit down inside Newberry's, picket those white stores, march to protest those unfair laws. Why? Even marching was against the law. Then, get arrested. Fill the jails, Mike proclaimed. Fill Birmingham's jails so full that policemen can't squeeze in one more person. Pack cells so tight that police will have to quit arresting people for demanding their rights. Audrey just knew Mike's plan would work. She twisted in her queue to see which grown-ups would walk down the aisle, volunteer for jail. But they mostly stayed put, eyes staring at their feet, hands on their knees. Feet, hands, and knees didn't move. Fill the jails, Mike pleaded, meeting after meeting, but heads shook. All around her, Audrey heard, no, best not break those segregation laws. Boss man will fire me, landlord will evict me, policemen will beat me. If nobody protested, Mike's plan would fail. Police would keep arresting anyone, anytime, for anything, forever. Audrey would never be able to go places and do things like everybody else. One night, Jim announced a new idea. If grown-ups won't do it, fill the jails with children. Audrey leaped to her feet. I want to go to jail, she declared. Mama looked deep and saw that Audrey's eyes begged, please. Okay, Mama said. Audrey strutted down that aisle. She was going to jail. Two mornings later, she put on a fresh pressed pinafore and shiny Mary Janes with turned down socks. Protesters got to look nice. In the meantime, her daddy bought her a game to help her pass the time in jail. Her mama and daddy took her by Center Street Elementary to tell her teacher she'd be absent, maybe for a whole week. Miss Wills wrapped her arms around her. Audrey knew she was proud of her. She said goodbye to her grandparents. You'll be fine, her grandmother said. She knew Audrey would be brave. So did Audrey. Then her mama and daddy drove her to 16th Street Baptist Church where the children were gathering. Even before she reached the door, Audrey heard loud voices chanting freedom songs. Inside, hundreds of big kids called out to friends and crowded around signs for their high schools. Parker, Carver, her head swiveled. Where was the sign for Center Street Elementary? She was the only protester from her school, the youngest child in the whole church, and she knew no one. Audrey huddled by her parents in the basement. But when Jim lined her up with the others 2 by 2 and the door swung open, Audrey straightened up. She was going to break a law and go to jail to help make things right. Clutching a protest sign in one hand and her game in the other, Audrey marched out the door. She stomped and sang. Half a block from the church, a white policeman stopped Audrey. He pointed toward a police van. Sentence, 1 week in juvenile hall. A matron locked Audrey into a day room with 24 other girls, all older, all bigger, all strangers. Audrey sat down alone and slipped the cover off her game. I told you to sit down, the matron yelled. Audrey jumped. She didn't remember standing up. The matron dragged her to a dark, empty room. When I tell you something, you do it, she commanded, or I'll leave you here. Trembling, Audrey quietly followed the matron back to the day room, put away her game, lay down her head, and cried. Jail was harder than she'd thought, and she wasn't fine after all. That evening, Audrey was hungry and tired. For dinner, soupy, oily, tasteless grits. At night, a bare mattress with one thin sheet for a cover. The next morning, no fresh underwear, no clean pinafore, no toothbrush. Audrey and her cellmates were led outdoors into an empty concrete pen surrounded by high prison walls. The older girls talked together. Audrey wondered what her classmates were doing. Miss Wills would be keeping them busy. On another day, Audrey was sent to a huge room and told to sit in a chair that was so high her feet dangled above the floor. 4 white men glared at her. She'd never talked to a white man before. "Are you against America?" one demanded to know. "No, sir," she answered politely. What do you talk about at all these meetings?" another asked. "Our freedom." "Why did you march?" "To go places and do things like everybody else." What was wrong with that? Every mealtime, Audrey stared at the greasy grits. She could barely spoon them into her mouth, let alone swallow them. At night, the cot's wire springs jabbed. Every morning, she had nothing to do but sit alone with her game. In the afternoons, though, more kids crowded into the day room. Some days, many of them arrived sopping wet. A girl explained that firemen aimed powerful hoses at the children. Surging water spun them off their feet and down the street. They got up and kept marching anyway, until they too were sent to jail. By Audrey's 5th day in detention, the police couldn't squeeze in one more person. We filled up all the rooms! We filled up all the rooms! Audrey practically jumped up and down. She was so proud. Watching television in the day room, she saw Black people stroll straight into stores and restaurants like they belonged there. No one else could be sent to jail. Everything had changed. After 7 days, Audrey was sent home. Her mama and daddy wrapped their arms tight around her, washed the jail off her, and for dinner, hot rolls baptized in butter. Two months later, the city of Birmingham wiped segregation laws clean off the books. Audrey licked her spoon clean at Newberry's counter like everybody else. Black and white together, like we belong. And that's the end of this book. So there are a lot of stories about the Children's March out there. We have a ton of books about it if you want to check any out on Curbside or on Libby. And I highly suggest bringing this one home and reading more about it. Reading the back of the book or trying the recipe in the back. All right, let's read another story about a child activist. The next person we're going to talk about is Greta Thunberg, who you've probably heard of. She started a worldwide school strike to fight against climate change and to raise awareness of climate change when she was 15 years old. And the book we're reading about her is Our House is on Fire, Greta Thunberg's Call to Save the Planet by Jeanette Winter. And this book does not have a lot of back matter like other books. It has a little bit. It has a small bibliography right here. It has the source of where the quotes come from in the book. And there's a little paragraph that I'm gonna read. Greta Thunberg was 15 years old when she skipped school one Friday to strike for climate change in front of the Swedish Parliament building in Stockholm. Her lone call to action on August 20th, 2018 sparked a children's movement that led to Friday school strikes in many countries and culminated in a worldwide Friday march on March 15th, 2019. Among the countries where students marched were Argentina, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Croatia, Cyprus, China, Czech Republic, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Iceland, India, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Luxembourg, Malta, Mexico, Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Philippines, Poland, Portugal, Russia, Slovakia, Slovenia, South Africa, South Korea, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Thailand, Ukraine, United Kingdom, Uruguay, and the United States. So she started that movement that led to all of these countries having a Friday strike on March 15, 2019. So let's read Our House is on Fire. And there's a quote that starts the book, and it says, "You are never too small to make a difference." Greta Thunberg. Greta is a quiet girl who led a quiet life in the city of Stockholm. Her dog Roxy was her friend. "All my life, I've been invisible," said Greta. Sorry, this is a brand new book, so the pages are very stiff. All right. I've been the invisible girl at the back who doesn't say anything, said Greta. In school, she felt alone. Then one day, Greta's teacher talked to the class about the climate, about how our planet is getting warmer, about how the polar ice is melting, about how animals' lives are threatened, and ours too. That's when Greta's life changed. She read for hours and watched film after film about our warming world. Greta could think about one thing for a long, long time. She saw ice melting into the sea, disappearing. She saw mighty winds and torrential rains howling across the land. She saw coral reefs deep down in the sea, pale as ghosts, bleached by the warming waters. Greta saw living creatures everywhere struggling to survive. Greta saw floodwaters covering houses and people and animals. Greta saw cities swallowed up by rising oceans. She saw the smoldering sun scorch the earth, leaving it bone dry. She saw the blazing wildfires racing through the forests. Our house is on fire. Greta became sad thinking about the climate all the time. She barely ate or spoke. Those pictures were stuck in my head, she said. The sad days went on for a long time, each day more unhappy than the next. There might not be a world to live in when she grows up. What use is school without a future? What can I do? She wondered. Greta decided to go on strike from school for the climate. Her parents understood. Greta skipped school one Friday and took her poster, School Strike for Climate, to the Parliament building to sit on strike. She hoped lawmakers would see her. People walked past, too busy to notice. Greta was invisible there too. She was at the Parliament building every Friday, even in the rain. Then word of her strike began to spread. Little by little, other school strikers joined her. On Fridays, Stockholm schools were a bit empty. More people started noticing the child strikers, and word spread through cyberspace about the Friday school strikes. Children started striking everywhere. If grown-ups won't act to save the planet, children will. The quiet girl who always felt invisible was asked to speak to very important people at the United Nations climate talks in Poland. Greta only spoke when she thought it was necessary. You say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their very eyes. We need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, said Greta. The quiet girl was invited to speak to important people at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. It was necessary to speak. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. I want you to act as if the house was on fire, because it is. Greta's protest, all alone, sparked a worldwide children's march. Her quiet voice, joined by thousands of voices, became a roar. Can you hear us? What will you do? And that's the end of this book. So like I said, with the Children's March, we have tons of books about Greta Thunberg, and there's tons of videos you can watch on YouTube about her speeches or about the strike that she helped inspire and organize. And I wanted to read these two books because They're about two activists who at 15 and 8 years old fought for what they believed was right. They were not too small to do it. They were not too young to do it. They did it because they were passionate about it and they knew what was right. And so I want to encourage you that if you have that passion, if you know what's right, if you want to fight for your rights, you're not too young to do it. And you can join anytime. Okay? So both of these books are available for curbside pickup, and we have tons of other books you can request. So I hope that you enjoyed this week's Who's Who Story Time, and I hope to see you next week. Bye.